Here we are back for another session. It's just so wonderful to be in these deep dive conversations with you. It lights up my whole week, month, the whole time I get to be considering these questions for myself, one to ask you, and then because as we know, it's the questions that work us.
And so important is the conversation. So I treasure this too, and we do these deep dives, and that's where the pearls are, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah, really takes some work to get them out. Let's start with Patanjali.
Mm.
So you've talked about how that's changed your life and your teaching, and but I want to know about the man, the myth, and the legend. And you speak about it, and you write about it in your book some. And I wonder, you might even read from your book if you want to, but you can also just talk to us. Who is Patanjali?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great question. And because yoga is so much of an oral tradition, you get bits and pieces. It's almost like asking about a family member, and everybody has their own perspective. So that's also been a real treasure hunt. Um, and in fact, there's even um, you know, translators or teachers who have taken on that moniker. So that's a curious thing as well. But Patanjali was really unique in that he re-systematized yoga. And this was really a revelation also because, there's this sense of, doing the real yoga and who's got the pure yoga. And most people have that sense and they champion it, and that's fine. The maybe real isn't correct, but that there's an authentic functionality and a purpose to yoga is really what's more significant to me. Um so yoga has been resystematized since the beginning because it's an art, it's a science, it's a living art and science. So it really, and that's part of its viability, is that it's here to support us. So the story is that Patanjali's grandfather was Hiranyagarbha, which essentially means the golden womb of the universe. And so Hiranyagarbha was the source of yoga. And if you can imagine that you were trying to truncate all of the wisdom that you've ever heard in your life, or even in yoga teachings, it's exhaustive. So Patanjali, as a grammarian, had this incredible gift of being able to whittle it down to the most salient points. And these are the Sūtra. And the Sutra link, Su means to link, and Tra means to protect and also to transcend. So they link the teachings with the teacher and the student to source wisdom from the golden womb, or also the golden heart of creation. So up to that point, basically you had to be a man, you had to be a Brahmin, you had to have access to, priests who were going to perform ceremonies and rites. And you really didn't have much volition in your life as far as your own growth, your own evolution. And so Patanjali was really a renegade in that way, in that he said, no, it's really on you. Now, don't throw away the teacher, don't throw away the teachings. These are vehicles that help you to navigate. And in this way, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So even the word atha, I think we spoke about that. Patanjali, he's saying right here, right now, here are the teachings that have been distilled down to the anu, to the essential aspects. And I'm going to show you a step-by-step process. I'm not going to tell you really where you're going, except for it's a much bigger field of awareness. I'm not going to tell you who you are. That's for you to discover. And even says, let go of ideas, have these experiences. And then Atha signifies that so much has come before me, that I am not the inventor. And isn't it interesting how, yoga has become, people will ask me, well, what kind of yoga do you teach? And I'm always kind of stumped, yoga, hatha yoga. Hatha yoga isn't really accurate because when we look in hatha yoga, it's missing yama and niyama, where Patanjali added that into the system, which is really our sense of morality. I mean, what does it all come down to? Is about unity and reunifying. So Patanjali was really a renegade in that way. And he apparently came from this tradition, the Shramana tradition of the Kapila lineage. But he, being an innovator, which yoga invites us to do, he broke those rules of you must do it this way, and you must have a teacher, and you must, perform these or pay others to perform these rites. So he was really unique. And then there's stories, this is just his human form. He was an avatara. So it's said that he's actually an incarnation of Adishesha, who was a naga and a serpent. And the unique thing about the serpent is the sense of, when we look at the symbology of the serpent represents that unbroken circle with the uraburo, where it's eating its own tail, and the sense that life feeds on life, and the cyclical aspect of it. I will eat and I will be eaten. I will untie. I will tie and I will be undone. And that continuous unfolding and collapsing in on itself of consciousness as well as evolution. So he had 1,000 heads, which is also really significant. And I go through this story in my book. It's a wonderful story. When he incarnates on Earth, he actually is forced to take on students. He doesn't want to take on students. He just wants to continue on in his own revelations. And the students start gathering because they see this deeply inspired mystic. And eventually, he has to agree to teach them. And so he does, on the condition that there's a screen between him and the students. And at one point, one of the students who breaks the rules, there's always a rascal in every group, and rascaldom is considered to be a divine attribute. That, how are we going to stretch consciousness unless we explore how we can, where there's movement in the rules? And this student looks behind the curtain and sees that Patanjali has reassumed his form as the 1,000-headed serpent. And so this really means the ability of the teacher to work with the student according to their desire, their capacity, and I don't mean just physically, but their psychological capacity, or even the constraints in their life. They maybe would love to be doing yoga all day, but they got to go home and do the dishes and take care of the children, or bring home the bacon. He definitely wouldn't have said that, but something like that. So, our ability to see the individual. And the other thing that's really interesting about the snake is that it has the capacity to live in the world and also go into the underworld. And yoga is so much about unlearning that sense of conditioning, and that your sense of self, your sense of satisfaction or contentment is based on external environment, and that we actually are able to go inwards in that process and to unearth and see what is under our standing. What is our true understanding? And so down, 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 I think there's like 9 lokas in the Naga realm. They're increasingly profound, and it's utter darkness in the land of the Nagas, but it's lit up by these luminous jewels and insights. So what's so wonderful about, Patanjali's yoga is that we really get to ask the questions. What am I longing for? What's missing? What am I yearning for? What can I give myself? What can I develop in myself? And so in the world, we rely on our strengths. And in yoga, we rely on where we're unstable to bring those parts of ourselves into the full gestalt, into the full, completing that circle again. And so much of it is that unearthing process. So yeah, Patanjali is a grammarian. He had this wonderful capacity to wordsmith, to pick terminology that had many, many layers. As an Ayurvedic physician, he understood that we can use the body to leverage the consciousness, that it's easier to change the body than the mind. And so he wrote, or he transmitted, it was pre-literate, teachings on this. And then his crowning jewel was the Yoga Sutra, which are the possibilities of consciousness. So he just basically puts out this, wonderful array of possibilities, and you get to see, you get to try, and then also, so we don't get stuck anywhere. We don't get stuck anywhere, and we don't miss the point. So honestly, until really integrating the sutras into as being the backbone, it's like the DNA strands or the skeletal teachings. It wasn't really growing me from the inside out. I mean, I would have moments of satori's, and certainly you get into this, biochemical blissful state after practice, but it wasn't really penetrating my being. Yeah. So Patanjali was really unique that way. He, yoga, the reins, he gives you the reins. And he also says in the sutra, spirituality is not associated with all stages of yoga. So it really raises the bar for us and reminds us, is able to articulate. So when we go into that deep place inside, it's a wordless place, which is a gift, but it can also be challenging to decipher what is truly a luminous jewel and what is a trinket.
How old is Patanjali?
Oh my God. Many scholars say about 2,500 years old. But really, and when I talked to Rama about it, she said her Sanskrit teacher said this particular form, because if you look, like, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, and people, I have a working knowledge of Samskrita because I want to understand the teachings, not to understand Samskrita. I want to understand the teachings and to utilize them to expand my field and my capacity for love and for joy and offering into life. So the form that he transmitted was not grammatically correct. And so her Samskrita teacher said that that style is at least 40,000 years old. And when I asked Pattabhi Jois how old they were, remember, you have to ask the question like 3 times to get any kind of a clear answer. He said, "Oh, very old, Bhavani." And I said, "Well, how old, Guruji?" "Older than the earth," which really makes sense, because how could we have a perspective of the earth-based experience unless somebody was standing outside of it? It's like the mouse looking at the elephant. We have to, go to another dimension. And even the language of the written form of Samskrita is called Devanagari. So it's an angelic language. It's not an earthly language. So I believe they're much older. I wouldn't say believe, I would say I know. I have a gut knowing that they're very old. Yeah, they're timeless. They're perennial.
Right, because truths outstand the test of time, right? Or they stand the test of time. Yeah.
And as it said, like Patanjali saying, I didn't discover this. These are universal truths. They're eternal truths. And I believe it's in the Quran. I'm not a student of the Quran, where it said that every like scripture is written on every leaf. It's running through every brook. It's, floating through the clouds. So in the yogic tradition, it said that all of this is encoded within our being. So we're really just learning to pay attention and be in touch with reality as it is. And if we're paying attention, as Rumi says, everything we need to know is being whispered to us at all times. And when we're not paying attention, that's what we call crisis. And that's where, it hits us hard.
There's so many things. Yeah. I just recently learned that Pythagoras, when he was teaching his students, and I don't know anything about Pythagoras, but he also sat behind a screen for the first 3 years that he was working with students. And he asked them to follow what he taught to the letter of the law for the first 3 years. And they didn't get to see him. And I thought that was very interesting, because I've heard you speak about Patanjali in the same way.
That's fascinating. And I, as you can see, I'm a bibliophile, so I really love books. And I remember I've shared these books with you, but the Hindu World encyclopedias, and it's like just it's a wonderful magical mystery tour. You can just open the book and start reading. And there was a whole section on the Greeks and how there was a great diaspora between the Greeks and the I guess the area. No, what were they? The Indus Valley. So there was a grand exchange of information happening there. And yeah, it really isn't about the teacher. The teacher just acts as, a conduit, but that's almost not accurate either, because the teacher and the student, they grow each other.
Yeah. And I'm going into all of these churches right now, and the symbology in Paris in these old churches, and there's temperance, and she's holding a branch of some sort, and the reins of a horse with a bit in the other hand. And I was like, there it is again, the symbology of, the reins of yoga and that tempering quality that one cultivates on the path.
It's interesting. Now that you say that, we don't just rein in the horse. Sometimes we crack the reins too. Yeah. And really seeing where, as it says in the sutras, our greatest challenge is tamas. And tamas in itself isn't a bad thing. It's solidity. It's kind of, what gives form, but it's also the sense of inertia. And for many people, their inertia is they can't slow down. And for others, to get into gear. So our ability to really learn to navigate ourselves and have that perspective of ourselves that we're it's like the spirit is raising the soul to its embodiment.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. The inertia is sometimes that we can't slow down. That's, I've been there. So I want you to clarify for me again. I know you spoke a little bit about this, but just the distinction between Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga and the Ashtanga Yoga taught by Sri K. Pattabhi Jois, because I often get questions about this as a yoga teacher, and I'm not clear. So perhaps you can clarify further.
Well, Pattabhi Jois, he, where is the origin? And there's a big question around that. There's stories that Krishnamacharya, and he discovered this very kind of fragile text on leaves, that they found these particular sequences described. And then when you asked about him, well, where is this? He would say, oh, bugs are eating. So that was a little bit curious. Who really knows with the lore, what the lore is of that? But essentially, it was a particular sequence of asanas. And so it had a real form. But what's so beautiful in Patanjali's system is that he doesn't exactly tell you what to practice. He tells you, it's an elastic, it's a flexible kind of a system. It's customizable to work with a student, but he tells you the project of practice and why you're doing practice. So when we have the why, we can figure out the how. And it said the yogi doesn't really wonder so much about like the hows. It could go either way, honestly, but when we have the why, we have that understanding. So, the sutra and the practice were never meant to be separated. And so I that's probably why it was put under this umbrella of Ashtanga Yoga. And it is a form of Ashtanga Yoga, but Ashtanga Yoga is not limited to this series of postures. So basically, it was a resystemization under the umbrella of Patanjali's yoga, which is also called Raja Yoga. Yeah. And it's
Thank
also
you.
called, wait, there's other names for it too. Let me think for a second. It was also called Vidya Yoga. And
I like that.
yeah. And so Vidya means your ability to pierce through to another layer. It's this process of remembering.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it kind of gets into like people, they take on these phrases like Ashtanga Yoga became this this set series of postures rather than the full picture, that includes Patanjali and the Yoga Sutra. And that's clear, more clear.
Yeah, and I always felt like it was almost like a clue or a hint that there was more to it than just the asana. However, Pattabhi Jois, he was very stringent as far as like, you must do it in this order. And, there was definitely wisdom in that. He said the way that you learn yama and niyama is through asana. Because how do you really learn loving care unless it's something that you're experiencing within yourself? So I can see the validity in that. However, what happens is that people just want you to tell them the truth and then they hold on to it. And so there becomes this almost like this, well, it's a cult, and a cult isn't a terrible thing. It's a culture. But many people who really lack the solidity in themselves, they become zealots. And, I've heard plenty of people call it the practice. And it's like, okay, it's your practice. And there's projections onto that, which is their need to feel like they're held in the real yoga, and it almost creates this sense of hierarchy. But again, if we go to the sutras, Patanjali, he doesn't there's only 3 sutra on the asana, and they don't even say like, you must take the right leg first in Padmasana. There's none of that. I mean, that was in Mysore, there was that. And it was like, oh my God, we all got so crooked from just doing the one side first. It doesn't speak about that at all. It speaks about the internal states of being, and that the posture is really the attitude that we carry.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And so how has Patanjali's Yoga Sutra changed your practice and your teaching? Because in the beginning, you didn't have these teaching, or I mean, they've always been there, but talk to me about that.
I would say that it really became more a process of self-inquiry. And what the sutra are affirmations. And the way that they hit me, it was like, I know this is true. Like, I've been longing to have this clarified, because it was like kind of like that underworld with these jewels, and it's like, okay, here's this jewel, and this is how it is, and this is why it is. And so it really kind of gives you points of stability, and it's like a truth serum. Am I really on track, or am I going further into this delusion? Where have I gotten stuck? Because the nature of our mind is obsessive. So of course we're going to find a teacher, we're going to find a practice, and we're going to be obsessive about it, which isn't a bad thing, unless we become a zealot or become inflexible. So the sutra really brought that to heart. Hatha yoga, or even samadhi pada. Samadhi means on reclaiming your wholeness. And so much of what we're doing, at least through the Western lens, is striving to become this idea of what we think realization is. And when we look in the sutras, it's saying, find your own wholeness. So it was very interesting being raised in really classical traditions, and then kind of, which had no name. There was no sense of, oh, this is this system, or this is this lineage. That came later. And, something we were always told was that yoga is about the preservation of your vitality. And of course, never force. And you hear that a million times, and then I was like in Mysore, and I was being cranked in these poses, which I mostly loved. And I could say no, thank you when I wanted to. But then just going like, wait a minute, is this ahimsa? Is this loving? Is this kind? Am I missing that point? And so also going through different phases of life, realizing that adaptability and malleability in the invocation for Patanjali, we call him Jangali Kayamane, which is like the jungle doctor and the jungle dweller. And your ability to tune into yourself, to tune into your changing needs, and not what you want, but what you need. So it really brought it back in to pay attention. You know, it's like a mother. You're looking at the whole being. You're looking at the heart. You're looking at the spirit. You're looking at the energy level. Love is that sense of attunement. And so it really becomes a practice of self-care instead of bolstering up a system. So the approach became very different for me internally, as far as seeing what I needed in my life. As I mentioned, you know, trying to get pregnant, I couldn't do that Ashtanga, Pattabhi Jois's Ashtanga system anymore, because it just wasn't supporting implantation, basically, of the ovum. I had to really shift the way that I practiced. And so this is what I really loved about Patanjali's system, was learning to see myself, my own individuality, learning to see others, and that the project of finding our wholeness, which is getting out of this state of fragmentation, moving into new non-duality, which is like, what am I becoming and what is my being? That's an interesting polarity, and it's not a bad polarity. It's a real state of energy. You need that to come into samapatibhyam, which is just dropping into homeostasis, and the organism of your body, which is all the time dying and replenishing, you know, the sense of who we are, before we can like heal that split within ourselves. Yoga, to come out of dualistic awareness, is to come into a state of love. Love precedes, or love is what creates that fusion. So being loving is being attuned, being sensitive, getting beyond the agenda and realizing the purpose.
Yeah, and we can end there. No. So yeah, and I find for myself, like, I really have to work it, because when I did my first yoga teacher training in college, I was, 23, and it was great. I learned a lot of really, really useful things, and we sort of skipped over, we touched on the Yoga Sutra. It was like a head nod in that direction, but so briefly that I don't even remember it. I found it in my notes and I was like, wow, I guess we did cover this. And then when I met you, it was the primary focus. Yes, we were doing asana, but what really lit me on fire was Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And I was like, wow, like how, like, it was almost like, how could I have kept these separate for so long? And I find that I have to actually work it, though, and learn them, and then actually apply them to my life, or else it just becomes philosophy. It just is like something, that I head knowledge, rather than these really important practical tools for living. And so I wonder if you have more to say about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because so many of us, the way that yoga is presented or shared is through the practices, which makes a lot of sense. It's like, here, try it, taste it, anu, you get a drop of that nectar and you're hankering for more. So you actually get to have a direct experience of it. And then the sutra are missing. And then if we look in the, in the East for a long time, the Yoga Sutra were really just kind of held into this private enclave of academics who didn't necessarily have a practice. So it's almost like they began to drift apart. But when we really look at the tradition, they were meant to be joined together. But the sutra, without the practice, yeah, it just becomes really trite kind of memes of wisdom. So the way that we authenticate these insights is through our practice. And so there's always been that transmission. And Patanjali even says, it's like pramana, right knowledge. There's agama, which is testimony from a trustworthy authority, whether living or whether it's scripture, and more specifically, it's inference based on this testimony. Then we have anumana, and manas. Manas are the 11 organs of cognition and motor organs, including the mind as one. So it's a process of trial and error in which we extract the anu. We experience the teachings for ourselves, which leads us into pratyaksha, direct experience. And when you have that direct experience, it's yours, it's penetrated you, it's living through you, and it's unshakable. So we need the two, they support each other. And it's so wonderful because when you have that, new worlds really open. Now, it's really interesting. I remember reading some of Mr. Iyengar's sharings of his own process, and he came to yoga really infirm. His mother had been ill when he was in utero. He suffered, I don't know, hepatitis or something like that he was very sickly. So when he was practicing yoga, he said, my focus was just getting out of pain. He didn't even have the bandwidth to go into the deeper layers of psychology. So there is a progression in how we go to it. And, but what a gift when we discover them, because it also validates what we're doing and why we're doing. We can kind of ride that honeymoon phase for a while with yoga practice, in which, it feels so good. And and then we go into life and we're like, oh, wow, I haven't really integrated it. But then when when the sutra come in, it starts to make sense. The practices show you the how, and then the sutras show you the why, and again open new possibilities. And really, it's not just about self-realization, self-actualization. This is about how we can shift the culture, the collective culture. And so we start in our intimate relationships with ourselves, and then to our family, then to our community. And like that 100th monkey, there's a transmission that happens through osmosis. We start to develop what's known as spiritual charisma. And spiritual charisma is just your ability to be in the presence of somebody and they're inspired. They're inspired by your sense of ease, your sense of curiosity, your compassion, your creativity, your ability to connect, the sense of intimacy that is there.
I mean, they're really profound. They're profound teachings because, as you said earlier, these truths can be found throughout time in many of the ancient texts. And that's continues to blow my mind that, they're just different ways of saying the same thing. And I had one more question. Do you know the particularly about the Yoga Sutra, do you know what language it was originally written in?
I don't know what you mean. It was some Samskrita. They weren't written.
Okay. It was just,
So, okay, that's a great
yeah,
question.
yeah.
And what it says, um, hang on a second. Svadhyaya Ishta Devata Samprayoga. So Svadhyaya, which is one of the niyamas, which is how we cultivate our inner space, is usually translated as being self-study. So it's like you were always meant to be learning these metaphysical teachings as you're doing the physical practices, right? The practice is basically the context to explore the content within. And yoga is this process of clarifying, like, is this learned? Is this something that, yoga again said, you come in whole, you come in with everything you need, but you're basically a seed with like a husk and a hard outer shell. And how are you going to get to that kernel inside? How are you going to get to the nourishment? So we learn to penetrate these layers of our being. It's not that you're moving from the outside. And even though it's a long journey where we thought to travel outside, we're actually traveling inwards to discover the whole creation, the whole world that is ready to meet us in this place of increasing intimacy, capacity for intimacy. So Svadhyaya is where we're, authenticating through the practices in tandem with the metaphysical teachings, and it's known as self-study. So we're studying the teachings, but we're really using the teachings to learn about ourselves. We're not learning about yoga, we're learning about self. But if we look a little deeper, sva also means sweetness, and dhya means to hold and to carry and to fill. So we're finding that sweetness, we're finding that nectar within ourselves. And then he says, Ishta Devata. And Deva means the light beings. And so within us, we all are a little bit of a demi-angel, and we're also a little bit of a demi-demon. We have kind of these inner voices within us. And what we just were looking at in yesterday's Yoga Sutra mentorship was seeing that the contradictions within us are not wrong. They're part of our dynamicism. So it's like, that push me, pull me, that tension of polarity that gives a lot of energy, that makes us dynamic. So Devata is like where we are polishing and shining those ultra self-reflective, transpersonal aspect of selves, where eventually the intellect is transformed into pure, spontaneous, clear intuition. It's not subliminal, suppressed impulses that need to be expressed and need to basically be vomited out of the system, but it's really moving from that place of spontaneity. So then we have Ishta, which means that which you wish. What is your deepest longing? And it also means what is. And it also means you have choices. You have choices. So Ishta Devata can mean that which you would like to shine and you reflect. So we kind of make it a loose sketch of an outline of how we want to be and how we want to experience, but then we're filled in by what is and the choices that we make. Oftentimes, Ishta Devata is translated as a deity or a form of the divine that you have an affinity towards. And this is where it's flexible too. Yoga predates Hinduism. It's not religious. Where religion is a belief system, yoga is to move beyond the BS of belief systems and to have your own epistemology, your own cosmology. So Ishta Devata, maybe you're a Krishna devotee, or maybe you're a lover of Christ consciousness, or of Muhammad, or of Moses, or the Baha'i faith, or, Jainism. It doesn't matter. Now, Ishta Devata, so these are all the layers, also means the virtues. So each of these embodiments of divinity have kind of a character and a quality. So what are the attributes that we want to shine forward? And we have that choice. And then there's some, which means on becoming whole again. The sum is greater than the parts, to bring together. Pra means to bring forth. And then yoga means union. So it said through this process of studying ourself, of learning about our own self, and as the Sufi says, when you can see the entire universe in a grain of sand, like then you're really learning to see. So we see it's all seated within us. We're not separate from us. Then these shining qualities come into us, and we're able to see these teachings everywhere. And so yoga is really a process of unburdening. I love what Rama would share often, this story. She was friends with Satchitananda, and at one point his students asked him, "Are you a Hindu?" And he said, "I'm more of an undo." So yoga is undoing, it's unwinding the stories that we wrap around things, the story of who we want to become versus the realization of the fullness that we've come in with, which he also says everyone's slightly unique and peculiar. Everyone's different in a wonderful way. So as we go into this unburdening process, that's what's known as lightening up or enlightenment. And intuitive insight is where you start to see patterns or themes that have been moving through your own story that you didn't recognize before. So it's essentially opening new neural pathways and getting the juices in our head and our body. Yoga is this churning process where we're stirring things up, and we're kind of, separating the ghee from the curd and getting this very juicy, golden, luminous, and isn't it wonderful that like ghee never goes rancid, right? I mean, it's just pure amrita, right? So as we lighten up, we literally become less dense and less coarse. And then eventually it comes to the point where, the dawning of realization that we're moving beyond this world of physical form into the psycho, spiritual, energetic realm, the quantum field. There's like, we're really seeing, we're really feeling, we're really having this direct experience. And then it said that we can actually hear these teachings, and they come in the form of shruti. So this is what the rishis did. The rishis were these light beings, and the rishikas, and they were able to hear or see or feel or even smell. It's not just limited to one sense. It's a deeper kind of a gut knowing. These perennial insights And then they were able to translate them into human speak. So this is really what we're, and then they just evaporated into that quantum field. And then it said that when they're needed, they're able to reincarnate into human form. So it's so lovely in the third sutra, Tada trashtuhu svarupe vastanam. Vasta is a contraction of ava from avatara, which means we basically we realize our own incarnation, that we all come in with unique gifts, and it's a dropping in. Stop. It's having a deep understanding of that, which we have to do the unearthing. You have to really work on that foundation. And Nam is that the love holds it all. Now, I totally forgot your question, but hopefully that touched the question.
That answered it. And then when they were written down in Sanskrit at some point.
That's it. They were written down in Sanskrit. But essentially, the way that the original transmission, which is continuous because it's outside of time, being perennial, it's true for the past, the present, and the future, was pure vibration. It's pure light. It's a language of light. And so, light, as it becomes more and more tangible, becomes form. And there in between, it said that between the manifest and the unmanifest world, sound and vibration is kind of that bridge. So it came in like the sound of buzzing, of humming. Even the sound of Om, pranava, means a humming sound. But it's very challenging to just go. So we put the but that buzzing is what reminds us of, the energetic signature underneath everything. When we sit in nature, it's far from quiet. There's the wind, there's the insects singing, there's the birds, there's the leaves moving to the, all of these elementals. And then, even in this world, like it's the buzz of the fan and of the refrigerator and the hum of the traffic. We start to realize that everything is being whispered to us. Everything is being revealed because yoga is Ishta Devata, is seeing what is, not what we would imagine it to be, but really extracting that nectar from what already is. So that's really shifted the way that I teach. It's like yoga reveals what already is, and you have choices. You have choices. And whatever, and you don't need to hold on to any of it because you've already come in your fullness. So where so many religions kind of focus on original sin, yoga reminds us of our original innocence and our original purity.
Thank you. And one more question to end that I didn't send you. So this is just from our conversation today. But if someone wanted to get an experience of that dropping in, what would you suggest to really and maybe we'll, one of the questions I had is to really get a sense of who I am, to where does one start to get a sense of who they are?
Whoa. I think you have to be curious about that. And, life in the end is our best teacher. and life is going to break our hearts over and over again. And so, Rama would always say, this is why I do Sarvangasana. And it said Sarvangasana or Salamba. Well, not always Salamba. It could be Niralamba, but shoulder stand is the mother, the queen of all asanas, because of the way that we bow our head to our heart. And Yoga's Chittavritti Nirodha is basically this trimming down of neural information, which physiologically occurs in these striated neurons in the brainstem, known as the reticular formation. So we receive something like, I think it's like 16, or is it 60,000 bits of information per second? And when we're in Sarvangasana, we can trim it down to 16 bits. So most of us are on overload. And honestly, it's not that yoga or the yoga is the only way, but it's a way that is, it's still intact. Where so many of these indigenous teachings through colonization, they were lost. And this is kind of part of the gift of maintaining the bloodlines, and where you marry into a certain bloodline, because the teachings were transmitted orally. So certain families were responsible for having learned by heart. And I don't just mean memorizing, but penetrating into their own being these and carrying these teachings forward. It was an inherited legacy. So, I would say taking on a practice, it's finding a teacher is really helpful. And we spoke about this, someone who is shining. It said what we're looking for, what we want to, when we're looking for a teacher, we want to see something that they're embodying, that we want to awaken in ourselves. And it's not that they're perfect, no one is perfect, but if this teacher is inspiring to you, if they move you in a deep way, if they are seasoned, if they have really been soaking in the metaphysical teachings and the practice, and really learning from that person and then taking it home. And I would suggest, that you take on 2 or 3 asanas, that you just keep it simple, but keep it consistent, and explore into that. And then, working with somebody who has a depth of understanding and a practice in the metaphysical teachings. I mean, this is where the Yoga Sutra online community is so profound, because it's the conversations, where my trainings changed. I used to have these really elaborate programs, and then I realized, oh my God, I have the manual here. It's the Yoga Sutras, and it's such a wonderful outline or skeletal frame to hold. It's the whole unfolding of the experience of yoga that we can track with that. So it's so concise, and yet it's so broad in its scope. It's a wonderful way of doing that. Our big challenge and also our gift is our tendency for eclecticism. And we've heard this, so many times, in Buddhist teachings and et cetera, that people dig shallow wells. So, find something that you want to go into some depth within. And what you're going to discover, if it's a really functional methodology, is that you're going to be going right into that wellspring, and you're able to source from source. So that's a really big question. And really, again, any way is possible. And this is where I love, where you can use the Yoga Sutras if you're a student of martial arts or a student of Buddhism, or, I mean, there will be slightly, there may be some arguments there, but they're positive arguments that get you to ask deeper questions and find what really resonates for you instead of trying to convert yourself. Yeah, it's really challenging because we those who come to practice or those who are searching are vikshipta, which means that they're kind of fickle. They're kind of fickle. So making that commitment to yourself and realizing that that commitment isn't to something outside of yourself, but it's a commitment to developing depth. It's like a marriage in some ways. So it's like, yeah, you use the teacher, you use the teachings, but it's about the commitment of depth of discovery. So we have to choose wisely. Yeah.
Don't worry, I'll ask you again. That was great. Thank you so much for these conversations. It's really, really useful.
My pleasure, Shinay.
Okay. Till next time.
Aloha.
Aloha.